There exists a particular and haunting paradox at the heart of modern pharmaceutical and chemical innovation. A paradox that emerges when the same institutions that produce genuine miracles of scientific achievement simultaneously engineer catastrophes of human suffering, when the very mechanisms that enable breakthrough medicines and chemical discoveries become the channels through which addiction, disease, and death are systematically distributed across populations who trusted those institutions with their lives. This is the story of how humanity's most advanced scientific and industrial enterprises have repeatedly prioritized the maximization of profit over the protection of human welfare, how they have done so across centuries and continents, and how they have managed to survive and thrive despite leaving trails of addiction, death, and destruction that would seem incompatible with continued existence in any rational system of accountability. The narrative spans from the late 19th century through the contemporary moment. From the laboratories of Germany where synthetic chemistry was revolutionizing the production of dyes, to the boardrooms of multinational corporations negotiating the terms of their own liability. From the moment when a young chemist synthesized a molecule that would kill millions to the present day, when corporations continue making calculations that prioritize shareholder value over human life. The story of methamphetamine and the story of Bayer are not separate narratives. They are parallel chapters in a much larger text about how modern corporations operate, about the systemic incentives that lead decision-makers to sacrifice human welfare for financial gain, and about the extraordinary difficulty of holding these institutions accountable when the consequences of their decisions are measured in deaths. Both stories begin in the same place, in German laboratories during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where chemists were making discoveries about the manipulation of molecular structures that would transform human civilization. Both stories involve the synthesis of powerful compounds whose effects on human biology were not fully understood at the moment of their creation. Both stories feature marketing campaigns that minimized dangers and emphasized benefits, that presented profitable products as solutions to human suffering while concealing evidence of catastrophic harm. And both stories demonstrate a consistent pattern across more than a century. The choice to continue producing and distributing profitable products even after evidence of serious harm had accumulated, the choice to market these products aggressively to populations least able to resist or understand the dangers, and the choice to prioritize financial gain over human welfare at every critical moment. The foundation for understanding both stories lies in recognizing how modern pharmaceutical and chemical companies are structured, what incentives drive their decision-making, and what mechanisms allow them to escape accountability for massive harm. A corporation exists, legally speaking, for a single purpose: to generate profit for its shareholders. This is not a moral principle, it is a legal and structural reality. The fiduciary duty of corporate executives is to the shareholders, not to the public, not to patients, not to the communities affected by corporate products. When these duties conflict, when serving shareholders means harming patients, the corporation is legally obligated to serve the shareholders. This is not a flaw in the system that will be corrected by better management or more ethical leadership. It is the fundamental architecture of the corporation itself. Within this structure, when a corporation discovers that a profitable product causes harm, the decision-making calculus becomes straightforward. If the profits exceed the costs of litigation and settlement, continue selling the product. If the costs of lawsuits and regulatory penalties exceed the profits, discontinue or reformulate the product, but never admit that the product was actually dangerous. Always maintain the position that you acted reasonably based on the knowledge available at the time, that you complied with all regulations, that the evidence linking your product to harm is contested and inconclusive. This calculus has remained remarkably consistent across more than a century of corporate decision-making. It did not change when scientists began documenting addiction to heroin in the early 1900s. It did not change when the dangers of selling blood products to developing countries became apparent in the 1980s. It does not change today as pharmaceutical companies continue making decisions about drug pricing, about marketing to vulnerable populations, about which safety studies to prioritize and which to minimize. The consistency suggests that this is not a matter of occasional bad judgment by particular executives. This is how the system is designed to function. The surprising part is not that corporations make these calculations. The surprising part is that we have structured our entire economic and legal system to allow them to do so. The story begins in 1863 in a German city called Barmen, in the industrial region of the Rhineland where the textile industry was booming. and the demand for synthetic dyes was creating unprecedented economic opportunity. Two men, Friedrich Bayer, a dye salesman, and Johann Friedrich Westcott, a master dyer, decided to form a partnership to manufacture and sell synthetic dyestuffs produced through the new chemistry of coal tar derivatives. This was a modest beginning with only 3 employees, but it represented the opening of a door to an entirely new industrial landscape. The company they founded would eventually become one of the largest pharmaceutical and chemical corporations in the world, a corporation that would shape global markets, influence governments, and leave a legacy measured in both miraculous achievements and catastrophic failures. Within 2 decades, the company had grown to over 300 employees. Within a century, it had become IG Farben, a cartel so powerful that it became intertwined with the Nazi regime. After the war, it was broken up and reconstituted, and Bayer emerged from that dissolution to become what it is today, a global pharmaceutical giant that manufactures products that millions of people depend on for their health and survival. But that is getting ahead of the story. In the 1890s, Bayer was still a relatively small company focused on manufacturing dyes and beginning to explore pharmaceutical applications of chemical synthesis. The company recognized that the same chemistry that could create colors from coal tar could potentially create medicines, substances that could affect human biology in measurable and potentially beneficial ways. In 1888, they established a pharmaceutical department and hired serious chemists, people trained at the best universities in Germany, people who understood organic chemistry at a level that would have seemed like magic to previous generations. The intellectual foundation for pharmaceutical innovation at Bayer was the realization that human illness, like human physiology itself, was fundamentally a matter of chemistry, that you could understand and manipulate biological processes by understanding the molecular structures that govern those processes. In the summer of 1897, a young chemist named Felix Hoffmann, working in Bayer's pharmaceutical laboratory, made 2 discoveries that would define the next century of pharmaceutical history. On August 10, 1897, Hoffmann synthesized acetylsalicylic acid by acetylating salicylic acid, a compound that had been extracted from willow bark for thousands of years, and that was known to have pain-relieving and fever-reducing properties. Hoffmann's synthesized version was more stable, easier to dose consistently, and potentially gentler on the stomach than the natural compound. This substance would eventually be marketed as aspirin, derived from the acetyl group and the spirea plant, and would become one of the most successful and beneficial medications in human history. Aspirin would save millions of lives, would become so ubiquitous that people rarely thought of it as a drug at all, would represent a genuine triumph of scientific innovation, producing a substance that improved human welfare without significant harm. But Hoffmann made another discovery that same summer. He acetylated morphine, the powerful painkiller derived from opium that had been used in medicine for decades and that was known to be highly addictive. The result was diacetylmorphine, a compound that was roughly 5 to 10 times more potent than morphine, that appeared to suppress coughs remarkably effectively, and that crossed into the brain faster than morphine itself, producing more intense effects more quickly. In early testing, the compound seemed to work beautifully for pain relief and cough suppression. What nobody fully understood, or rather, what Bayer's executives chose not to fully acknowledge even as evidence accumulated, was that the acetylation that made diacetylmorphine so potent also made it exponentially more addictive. The modification that made the drug more effective for pain also made it more effective at hijacking the dopamine system, more effective at creating the neurological changes that produce addiction, more effective at enslaving people to chemical dependency. Bayer named the new compound heroin, derived from the German word heroisch, meaning heroic, because the drug made people feel heroic, made them feel capable and invincible and powerful. The name was brilliant marketing. It conveyed power and mastery and triumph. It suggested that heroin was a substance that would make people better, stronger, more able to overcome the challenges of existence. In 1898, Bayer presented heroin to the medical community at a congress of German naturalists and physicians, and the response was enthusiastic. Here was a synthetic compound produced through modern chemistry, demonstrating all the benefits of pharmaceutical innovation. It was more potent than any available alternative, it had fewer side effects than morphine, and early evidence suggested it could be used safely. Within the first year of commercial production, Bayer produced more than a ton of heroin and exported it to 23 countries. They created multiple formulations, lozenges, salts, pastilles, for different medical applications in different populations. And they began an aggressive marketing campaign that presented heroin as safe, as appropriate for treating a broad spectrum of conditions, and as particularly suitable for use in children with coughs and respiratory infections. Meanwhile, in the German chemical industry, another transformation was occurring that would eventually lead Bayer into the darkest chapter of its corporate history. The success of Bayer and other German chemical companies had created an industry so powerful and so economically significant that consolidation seemed like the logical next step. In 1925, 6 major German chemical companies merged to form IG Farben, a massive cartel that would dominate global chemical and pharmaceutical markets. Bayer became one constituent of this larger entity, maintaining its identity and operations but now embedded within a much larger structure with political and economic influence that extended far beyond commercial concerns. The executives of IG Farben understood that their company had become more than just a business. It had become an institution of national significance, a repository of chemical knowledge and industrial capacity that could serve either commercial or military purposes. And when the opportunity arose to serve those purposes for a government that would eventually embark on genocide, IG Farben, and Bayer as its constituent company, made the choice to cooperate. The emergence of heroin as a mass-market pharmaceutical product in the decade following its synthesis represents one of the clearest examples of how aggressive marketing, institutional confidence, and the concealment of emerging evidence of danger can drive the distribution of an addictive substance across entire populations. By 1900, heroin had become Bayer's #1 product, more popular than aspirin, more profitable, more trusted by the medical establishment and the public. The marketing was extraordinarily sophisticated for its era, employing visual imagery and rhetorical claims that emphasized safety, efficacy, and the modern scientific progress that pharmaceutical innovation represented. Advertisements showed smiling housewives administering heroin to children, depicted eager children reaching for bottles of the substance, promised parents that heroin was safe, non-addictive, and appropriate for treating the coughs and colds that plagued childhood. The medical establishment prescribed heroin with confidence for respiratory infections, for tuberculosis, for various painful conditions, for general fatigue and low mood. The substance was marketed to diverse populations with diverse motivations, to physicians as a scientific advance, to patients as a solution to suffering, to the general public as evidence of progress and modernity. But even as heroin was reaching the peak of its market penetration and profitability, evidence was accumulating that the substance caused addiction. Doctors were reporting patients who requested or demanded continued prescriptions, who experienced distress when access was restricted, who displayed behavioral and physiological symptoms consistent with chemical dependency. Medical journals published case studies documenting addiction patterns. Physicians wrote letters to Bayer expressing concerns about whether heroin was truly safe for long-term use. The company had access to this information. Their scientists were hearing the reports. Their executives were receiving correspondence from physicians and researchers documenting addiction. And yet they continued marketing heroin, continued producing it in ever greater quantities, continued asserting that the substance was safe and non-addictive. The choice to continue was fundamentally a choice about money. Heroin was extraordinarily profitable. Discontinuing production would have meant sacrificing that profitability, admitting that marketing claims had been misleading, acknowledging that the company had distributed an addictive substance to millions of people, including children. It was easier to continue the deception than to confront these realities. This pattern, early evidence of harm ignored or downplayed, continued production and marketing driven by profitability, eventual regulatory action forcing discontinuation, would repeat throughout Bayer's history. What differed was the scale of the harm and the time lag between when evidence of danger became clear and when the corporation finally ceased distribution. In the case of heroin, the lag was substantial. Bayer did not discontinue marketing heroin as a cough suppressant until approximately 1913, more than a decade after the evidence of addiction had become overwhelming. Regulatory action, in the form of the Harrison Narcotics Act of 1914 and the subsequent Anti-Heroin Act of 1924, eventually prohibited the manufacture and distribution of heroin for any purpose in the United States and most other countries. But even these legal prohibitions could not undo the addiction epidemic that Bayer's marketing had created. Thousands of people, including children, had become addicted to heroin. Many had died from overdoses. Others spent decades struggling with dependency. Some transitioned to other opiates or to morphine obtained through black markets. The addiction crisis that Bayer's aggressive marketing had created did not disappear simply because the legal supply was cut off. It went underground, creating black markets and criminal networks that would persist throughout the 20th century and into the contemporary era. What is most striking about this first scandal in Bayer's corporate history is how completely it was erased. By the 1930s, official Bayer materials rarely mentioned the company's role in manufacturing and marketing heroin on an industrial scale. The advertisements were removed from archives. The history was rewritten. Company publicity emphasized the success of aspirin while treating the heroin chapter as an unfortunate mistake or an isolated lapse in judgment, rather than as a systematic choice to prioritize profits over human welfare. This pattern of erasure would also repeat throughout Bayer's history. Whenever a product or practice became sufficiently embarrassing or legally risky, the company would attempt to minimize the historical record, to frame past decisions as products of different times and different understandings, to position itself as having learned from mistakes without ever truly acknowledging the moral weight of those mistakes. As the 20th century progressed, and as World War II approached, Bayer's corporate trajectory took a turn that would lead to direct complicity in one of human history's greatest catastrophes. The chemical companies of Germany, including Bayer through its incorporation into IG Farben, recognized that the Nazi regime represented both a threat and an opportunity. The threat was obvious: a totalitarian government interested in controlling industry and directing resources towards state objectives. The opportunity was equally obvious: a government that was embarking on massive rearmament, that would need chemical products for military purposes, that would compensate companies generously for serving national interests as those interests were defined by Nazi leadership. The executives of IG Farben made the decision to support the Nazi regime. They became the single largest donors to Hitler's election campaign. They negotiated contracts for synthetic rubber, synthetic fuels, and countless other chemical products essential to the German war economy. And when the Nazi regime began implementing the Holocaust, the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others deemed enemies of the state, IG Farben and its constituent companies, including Bayer, chose to cooperate. The most direct and most horrifying evidence of this cooperation involved the construction of a massive synthetic rubber factory near the concentration camp at Auschwitz. In 1941, IG Farben executives, including Otto Ambros, a director who would negotiate directly with the SS, selected the location near Auschwitz for a Buna facility, a complex that would produce synthetic rubber essential for the war effort. The advantages of the location were evaluated with brutal coldness. The geology was suitable, rail connections existed, water supply was available, coal and other raw materials were accessible. But one advantage was decisive: there was already a concentration camp there, a ready supply of human labor, prisoners who could be worked to death and replaced with new prisoners, whose labor would cost the company only a minimal daily fee paid to the SS. IG Farben negotiated the price, 3 to 4 Reichsmarks per prisoner per day. None of this money went to the prisoners themselves, it all went to the SS. The company was essentially renting human beings, people who would be worked until they died or were selected for murder, and paying a pittance for the privilege. The construction of the Buna facility at Auschwitz began in 1941 and continued throughout the war. Tens of thousands of prisoners were used as construction workers. They worked 12-hour shifts, they were given minimal food, they were beaten regularly. If they became too weak to work, they were sent back to the main camp and likely selected for the gas chambers. The life expectancy for a prisoner working on the IG Farben construction site is estimated at approximately 4 months. 4 months! The company knew this, they understood the conditions. They continued requesting more prisoners as workers died or became unable to work. It is a measure of the corporate cynicism involved that the letters requesting additional workers are preserved in archives. Formal correspondence between Bayer representatives and the SS Commandant Rudolf Hirsch, requesting new cohorts of prisoners because the previous cohorts had died. The factory itself, despite the massive investment and the enormous human cost, never actually produced significant quantities of synthetic rubber during the war. The construction took too long. Allied bombing disrupted operations, but the attempt to build it killed tens of thousands of people. Even more directly evil than the construction project were the medical experiments conducted by Bayer employees at Auschwitz. A Bayer physician and SS captain named Helmuth Vetter conducted pharmaceutical experiments on female prisoners in Block 20 of the women's camp at Birkenau. The experiments involved deliberately infecting healthy women with diseases like tuberculosis, typhoid, and diphtheria, and then testing experimental drugs on them to see if the drugs would treat the infections. This was not medical treatment of people who happened to be sick. This was the deliberate creation of disease in human beings for the purpose of testing pharmaceuticals. The women experienced severe side effects, circulation problems that turned their extremities blue, vomiting blood, intestinal destruction that caused them to pass fragments of their own mucous membranes, agonizing pain, and death. Every single woman in the experimental cohorts died. The success rate in terms of keeping subjects alive was 0%. The correspondence between Bayer and the camp is almost unbearably chilling. In one letter, a Bayer employee wrote, "The transport of 150 women arrived in good condition. However, we were unable to obtain conclusive results because they died during the experiments. We would kindly request that you send us another group of women to the same number and at the same price. This is a request for replacement experimental subjects because the previous cohorts had died." The tone is bureaucratic and matter of fact. The price being negotiated is 150 Reichsmarks per woman. The problem being identified is not that 150 women have been murdered in the course of experiments, but that the experiments failed to produce conclusive results before the subjects died. It is a perfect encapsulation of how corporate logic and the compartmentalization of human suffering can function. The deaths of 150 women are reduced to an inconvenience, a loss of useful data, a reason to request more subjects. The post-war reckoning for IG Farben's role in the Holocaust was extraordinary in its inadequacy. In November 1945, the Allied forces confiscated IG Farben and placed its assets under control. The company was to be dissolved, its assets used for war reparations. From 1947 to 1948, the IG Farben trial took place as one of the subsequent Nuremberg trials. 23 IG Farben directors and executives were tried for war crimes. The charges included plunder, slavery, and mass murder. 13 were convicted, 10 were acquitted, but the sentences imposed on those convicted were shockingly lenient when considered against the scale of the crimes. Fritz Termeer, the chairman of the technical committee directly responsible for the Auschwitz facility, who had made multiple visits to the camp and received detailed reports about conditions, who had written about the fine friendship with the SS, was found guilty of slavery and mass murder. He received a sentence of 7 years. 7 years for slavery and mass murder that killed tens of thousands of human beings. Other executives received similarly inadequate sentences. Some were convicted of lesser charges and received sentences of only 18 months or 2 years. These were men who had participated in decisions that resulted in the deaths of thousands. And by 1951, all of the convicted executives had been released from prison. The United States, increasingly focused on the emerging Cold War and seeing West Germany as a crucial ally against Soviet expansion, instituted good time credits that allowed early release. The men who had participated in crimes against humanity were let out after serving only fractions of their already lenient sentences, and then they returned to work in the chemical and pharmaceutical industry. In 1952, Fritz Termeer was released from prison. By 1956, he was elected to the chairman of Bayer's supervisory board, one of the most powerful positions in the company. He held this position until 1964. Here was a man convicted at Nuremberg of slavery and mass murder, serving only a few years for those crimes, and then ascending to one of the highest positions in German industry. The reemergence of Bayer as an independent company in 1951 was presented as a kind of fresh start. IG Farben was dissolved. Its assets were divided among the original constituent companies. Bayer reemerged as Farbenfabriken Bayer AG. Legally, this was a new entity, not responsible for the crimes of IG Farben. Never mind that it occupied the same facilities, employed many of the same people, had access to all the intellectual property and technical knowledge that IG Farben possessed. Legally, this was a new beginning, and Bayer took full advantage of that new beginning. The company rebuilt rapidly during the post-war years and benefited enormously from the German economic miracle, the Wirtschaftswunder that transformed West Germany from a devastated nation into an economic powerhouse. By the mid-1970s, Bayer, BASF, and Hoechst were once again among the world's largest chemical and pharmaceutical companies. The pattern of atrocity and renewal had been completed. Commit crimes against humanity, face minimal consequences, return to business as usual, and continue to dominate your industry. During these same decades, methamphetamine was following a different but parallel trajectory that would eventually reveal many of the same patterns of corporate decision-making and institutional harm. The synthesis of methamphetamine in 1893 by Nagai Nagiyoshi in Japan had produced a compound that remained essentially a laboratory curiosity for decades. The drug had no established medical applications and no commercial production. In 1919, Akira Ogata refined the synthesis process, creating a more efficient and more accessible methodology for producing methamphetamine. But still, the substance remained in the realm of academic chemistry. It was not until the 1930s in Nazi Germany that methamphetamine became a mass-produced commodity. The cultural context of Nazi Germany, with its obsession with productivity, efficiency, and human performance, created ideal conditions for the adoption of a powerful stimulant. Temmler Pharmaceuticals, a German company, recognized the market opportunity and began manufacturing methamphetamine under the brand name Pervitin. The marketing was remarkably similar to Bayer's marketing of heroin decades earlier. The substance was presented as safe, as appropriate for treating a broad spectrum of conditions, as a miracle of modern chemistry that could enhance human productivity. Pervitin was advertised as a treatment for depression, fatigue, lack of motivation, and general dissatisfaction with life. The marketing materials showed smiling workers, alert students, productive housewives, all ostensibly enhanced through pharmaceutical means. Temmler manufactured and distributed Pervitin in multiple forms, including chocolate confections marketed under names like Panzerskokolade, Tank Chocolate, allowing consumers to obtain methamphetamine in the form of candy. The consumption of Pervitin spread rapidly through German society. By the late 1930s, millions of tablets were being produced annually. Pharmacies struggled to keep adequate stock. The substance had become integrated into German culture as a pharmaceutical solution to the fatigue and limitations that characterized modern existence. When the German military recognized Pervitin's potential, the trajectory of methamphetamine transformed from a civilian pharmaceutical to a military chemical enhancement tool. The military began systematic testing of the drug, and by 1940 had made it standard issue for soldiers. Millions of tablets were distributed through military supply channels with the same bureaucratic efficiency as ammunition and weapons. The Blitzkrieg invasion of France in spring 1940 was explicitly executed with soldiers operating under methamphetamine influence. Tank crews pushed through the Ardennes forest in sustained assaults requiring multiple consecutive days without sleep, an achievement that violated conventional military wisdom about biological requirements for rest, but that was achieved through chemical enhancement. The tactical advantage provided by methamphetamine was real and measurable. Soldiers appeared to operate with greater aggression, maintained focus despite exhaustion, and demonstrated reduced fear responses that made them willing to engage in dangerous assaults. But what the military command either did not recognize or chose to ignore was that the short-term tactical advantage would be counterbalanced by addiction, health deterioration, and behavioral problems that would eventually undermine military effectiveness. By the late 1930s and 1940s, both heroin and methamphetamine had become integrated into German society through legitimate pharmaceutical channels. Both were manufactured by major pharmaceutical and chemical companies. Both were marketed with claims of safety and efficacy. Both were distributed to millions of people. Both were eventually discovered to produce addiction and serious health effects. And in both cases, the knowledge of these dangers accumulated over years while the substances continued to be manufactured, marketed, and distributed because they remained profitable. The similarity suggests not coincidence, but rather reveals a consistent pattern in how pharmaceutical and chemical companies operated, a pattern rooted in the economic incentives that drove corporate decision-making, in the difficulty of acknowledging and confronting evidence of harm, and in the institutional structures that allowed individual executives to make decisions that affected millions of people without facing personal consequences for those decisions. The post-war United States became the next arena in which both substances would be reintroduced and redistributed, this time with American corporate marketing and American pharmaceutical legitimacy. The American pharmaceutical industry, examining the evidence of both methamphetamine's military utility in Nazi Germany and heroin's earlier widespread use, concluded not that these substances should be avoided, but rather that they could be implemented more successfully in an American context with better medical oversight and better regulatory frameworks. The confidence reflected a particularly American form of institutional hubris, the belief that American science, American business practices, and American capitalism could accomplish with these substances what other nations had failed at, that American exceptionalism extended even to the metabolism of dangerous drugs. In the 1950s and 1960s, methamphetamine-based products began appearing on American pharmacy shelves under brand names like Dexedrine, Benzedrine, and various other pharmaceutical formulations. The marketing targeted medical professionals and the general public with claims that emphasized the substance's capacity to enhance productivity, suppress fatigue, and improve mood. Housewives exhausted by the impossible demands of post-war domestic life were prescribed methamphetamine to help them maintain energy for household labor and childcare while preserving the appearance of perpetual cheerfulness. Students facing intense academic competition discovered that pharmaceutical amphetamines could enable them to study for extended periods without sleep. Truck drivers found that amphetamines allowed them to maintain schedules that would be physically impossible under normal human sleep requirements. The pharmaceutical industry manufactured billions of tablets annually. Production levels far exceeded what would have been necessary for treating rare medical conditions. Instead, the scale reflected the routine prescription of these substances for conditions that were common and that affected large segments of the population. The medical establishment prescribed these substances with confidence, viewing amphetamines as legitimate pharmaceutical interventions for the fatigue and low mood that characterized modern existence. The FDA approved these products with minimal scrutiny, asking primarily whether they appeared to kill people immediately rather than investigating long-term effects or addiction potential. The regulatory oversight was adequate for approving the immediate effects, but inadequate for understanding the broader consequences of distributing powerful stimulants to millions of people. By the 1960s and early 1970s, the pattern was becoming apparent. People who had been prescribed amphetamines regularly were becoming dependent on them, experiencing withdrawal symptoms when access was restricted, requiring escalating doses to achieve the same effects. The medical establishment was slowly recognizing that they had created a mass addiction problem through legitimate pharmaceutical channels. Simultaneously, blood products derived from plasma became another arena in which pharmaceutical companies would make calculation about liability and profit that would result in the deaths of thousands. The treatment of hemophilia, a genetic bleeding disorder, had been revolutionized by the development of factor VIII concentrate, a clotting factor extracted from donated blood plasma that could be injected to restore clotting capacity in hemophiliacs. The production of factor VIII required pooling plasma from thousands of donors. A single batch might contain plasma from 10,000 different people. This pooling created extraordinary efficiency and made treatment accessible to hemophiliacs around the world. But it also created vulnerability. If any of those 10,000 donors had a blood-borne disease, the entire batch was contaminated. In the early 1980s, a new disease emerged that nobody fully understood yet. It would be called AIDS, acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, caused by a virus called HIV that was transmitted through blood. The first cases that would eventually be recognized as AIDS-related were reported in 1981. By mid-1982, the pattern was becoming clear. Hemophiliacs who had never used intravenous drugs, who had no other risk factors for the disease, were developing the same immune system collapse that was being documented in other populations. On July 16, 1982, the CDC reported that 3 hemophiliacs had contracted the disease. The conclusion was inescapable: whatever caused AIDS was being transmitted through blood products. The blood products industry faced a catastrophic threat to its business model. If blood was contaminated, the entire enterprise was at risk. But there was no test for HIV yet. The virus had not even been isolated and identified. The companies could not screen donors, they could not test the blood. All they could do was try to avoid high-risk donor populations. But changing donor screening was expensive and complicated. The companies had been sourcing blood from wherever it was cheapest, from paid plasma donors in areas with high rates of intravenous drug use, from prisoners, from donors at bathhouses, and in urban areas with large gay populations. Changing course would mean losing supply and increasing costs. In January 1983, a manager of plasma procurement for Qatar Biological Bayer's Blood Products Division wrote an internal letter acknowledging that there is strong evidence to suggest that AIDS is passed on to other people through blood. The company knew they had the evidence. They knew which blood supplies were high risk. They knew the danger was real. But they did not immediately implement rigorous screening. They did not discontinue using high-risk donor populations. Instead, they continued producing factor VIII using plasma that included those populations. And they continued selling it because hemophiliacs had no alternatives and would continue to purchase the product because without it they would bleed to death. Then in early 1984, Qatar developed heat treatment, a process by which heating the factor VIII concentrate to a specific temperature for a specific duration could kill viruses, including HIV. This was the safer product. This is what should have been sold everywhere immediately. But Qatar had a problem. They still had large stocks of the old unheated product, the product made before heat treatment, the product that carried a high risk of HIV contamination. What would they do with that inventory? A normal, ethical company would have destroyed it, accepting the financial loss as the cost of ensuring the safety of the product being distributed. But Qatar made a different decision. Instead of destroying the old stock, they decided to sell it overseas. The heat-treated product, the safer version, went to the United States and Western Europe, where regulatory oversight was stringent and medical professionals were becoming aware of AIDS risks. The old, unheated product was shipped to countries with less stringent regulatory oversight, countries where the medical community might not be fully aware of AIDS risks, countries where supply was limited and demand was growing. They sent untreated factor VIII to Argentina, to Malaysia, to Singapore, to Indonesia, to Japan, to Latin America. In June 1983, Qatar sent a letter to distributors in nearly 24 countries downplaying the AIDS risk, calling it the center of irrational response in many countries. This was the same year the CDC was warning that blood products were clearly linked to AIDS transmission. Bayer knew this. They had the CDC reports, but they were telling their foreign partners that concerns about AIDS contamination were irrational. In late 1984, a Hong Kong distributor asked Qatar about the newer heat-treated product. Internal records show that Qatar's response was to ask the distributor to use up stocks of the old medicine before switching to the safer version. Use up stocks, finish off the inventory of contaminated product, then switch to the safe version. By this point, hemophiliacs in Hong Kong were testing positive for HIV. Local doctors were beginning to suspect they were receiving contaminated medicine. Qatar's response was to assure the distributor that the unheated product posed no severe hazard and was the same fine product they had supplied for years. This is the same pattern that had characterized Bayer's marketing of heroin 60 years earlier, and that continues to characterize corporate decision-making about pharmaceutical products today. The numbers that eventually emerged from the HIV-contaminated blood crisis are staggering and heartbreaking. In the United States alone, estimates suggest 6,000 to 10,000 hemophiliacs became infected with HIV from contaminated blood products. In France, approximately 4,000. In Canada, about 2,000. In the United Kingdom, about 1,200. Japan saw roughly 4,000 cases, with nearly all traced to contaminated clotting factors. In Latin America, at least 700 hemophiliacs contracted HIV from contaminated blood products. By 1992 in Europe, at least 5,000 hemophiliacs had been infected with HIV. More than 2,000 had developed full-blown AIDS. Over 1,250 had died. These are not abstract numbers, these are individuals, many of them children, some of whom contracted HIV from a single contaminated dose. A 12-year-old boy with severe hemophilia received an injection of factor VIII that had been manufactured before heat treatment. The product came from Qatar, distributed through channels that had routed unheated factor VIII to developing countries. The boy developed symptoms of HIV infection within months. His parents watched as their child's immune system deteriorated. In the era before effective antiretroviral therapy, before modern HIV treatment, an HIV diagnosis was essentially a death sentence. The boy would have a few years, maybe longer if he was fortunate. But eventually, his immune system would fail, and opportunistic infections would overwhelm his body. This child would die of a disease contracted through a product manufactured by a company that knew the product was contaminated and sold it anyway, because destroying the contaminated inventory would have been more expensive than shipping it to countries with less regulatory oversight. The lawsuits began in the mid-1990s. In the United States, Bayer and 3 other companies that made Factor VIII agreed to pay $640 million to settle cases on behalf of more than 6,000 infected hemophiliacs. That was roughly $100,000 per person whose life had been devastated by HIV, nowhere near enough to compensate for decades of illness or for the loss of life. In 2003, documents emerged showing the full extent of what had happened. Internal memos, letters between Cutter representatives and distributors. The evidence was damning. The New York Times published a major investigative piece, Two Paths of Bayer Drug in 80s, Riskier One Steered Overseas. Bayer's response was characteristically evasive. They said they complied with all regulations at the time. They said you cannot judge 1980s actions by 2003 standards and knowledge. But this defense collapsed under scrutiny. The CDC was warning about AIDS transmission through blood products in 1982. Cutter developed heat treatment in 1984. They knew the old product was risky, they knew the new product was safer, and they chose to sell the old product to foreign markets. In 2011, Bayer quietly settled additional cases, paying tens of millions of euros to hemophiliacs in Europe. The settlement got coverage in French and Italian media but almost no English-language press. This is pattern consistent with how Bayer handled its scandals. Avoid publicity when possible, settle quietly, never admit fault, pay money to make the problem go away. And the company continued. Bayer, by the 2010s, was worth billions of dollars. The HIV-contaminated blood scandal was just another chapter they preferred people forget about. During the decades when blood products were creating an HIV epidemic among hemophiliacs, methamphetamine was following a completely different trajectory in the United States. The prescription amphetamine era that had dominated the 1950s and 1960s began to decline in the 1970s as evidence of addiction accumulated, and as the Controlled Substances Act of 1970 placed amphetamines into Schedule II, acknowledging high addiction potential but accepting continued medical use. However, the transition from prescription to black market methamphetamine happened gradually and unevenly. The decline in medical prescriptions created demand that legitimate channels could no longer supply, which created opportunities for clandestine production. Knowledge of how to synthesize methamphetamine, which had been documented in academic literature and in various chemistry texts, became increasingly accessible. By the 1980s, amateur production of methamphetamine from pseudoephedrine, the active ingredient in common over-the-counter cold medicines, became economically viable, particularly in rural areas of the United States that had been devastated by agricultural collapse and economic decline. Rural America in the 1980s faced economic catastrophe. Farm prices collapsed, agricultural loans became impossible to pay, family farms that had existed for generations went bankrupt. The economies of rural towns that depended on agriculture collapsed. Young people left for cities because there was no work. The people who remained faced unemployment, poverty, and the slow death of their communities. Into this economic despair came methamphetamine, offering two things that desperate people needed: an escape from unbearable circumstances and a way to make money. The conversion of $50 worth of cold medicine and chemicals into product worth thousands provided an economic opportunity that was irresistible to people facing financial collapse. The production of methamphetamine was dangerous, toxic, and illegal, but it was also lucrative in ways that legitimate employment opportunities were no longer available. The explosion of methamphetamine production in rural America created environmental and health crises that paralleled the corporate decisions being made by pharmaceutical companies in urban centers and in developed nations. The chemical synthesis of methamphetamine produced toxic fumes that permeated the spaces where production occurred, creating poisonous environments for anyone in those spaces, particularly children who often lived in homes where methamphetamine was being synthesized. The waste produced by methamphetamine synthesis was toxic and was often disposed of in environmentally damaging ways. The contamination created by methamphetamine production persisted long after the production had ended, rendering properties unusable and creating environmental hazards that affected surrounding communities. The health effects of methamphetamine use itself, the dental destruction, the skin damage, the weight loss, the premature aging, the behavioral deterioration, became increasingly visible through the 1980s and 1990s. Users' physical deterioration happened over months rather than years, creating visible markers of addiction that were impossible to conceal. The cardiovascular effects of methamphetamine resulted in heart attacks and strokes in users who were still young enough that such events would be extraordinarily unusual absent drug use. The neurological damage was permanent in many cases, resulting in cognitive impairment that persisted even after users had discontinued drug use. The addiction was profound and was characterized by extraordinary difficulty in achieving recovery, with relapse rates that reflected both the physical properties of the drug and the psychological changes that sustained use produced in the brain. The fundamental similarity between the trajectory of heroin and blood products and methamphetamine lies in how institutional decision-making about profitable but dangerous substances functions across different contexts and different time periods. Whether the substance is heroin marketed by Bayer in 1900, methamphetamine distributed by Cutter in 1984, or methamphetamine manufactured in trailer parks in rural America in 1990, the pattern is consistent. First, a substance is recognized as having profitable applications. Second, the substance is manufactured and distributed through available channels. Third, as evidence of harm accumulates, institutional actors face a decision about whether to continue or discontinue production and distribution. Fourth, when the substance is profitable, institutions consistently choose to continue despite evidence of harm. Fifth, when the harm becomes so obvious or so legally costly that continuation becomes impossible, institutions minimize the historical record, settle lawsuits, and move on to other products. This is not a pattern that emerges from occasional bad judgment or from corruption of otherwise sound decision-making processes. This is how the system is designed to function. The difference between corporate pharmaceutical decision-making and amateur methamphetamine production lies in the scale and the legitimacy, not in the underlying logic. A major pharmaceutical company like Bayer or Cutter faces regulatory oversight, faces potential litigation, faces public accountability. An individual or small group manufacturing methamphetamine in a rural area faces law enforcement risks and health risks, but operates outside the formal system. Yet in both cases, the decision-making is driven by the same economic calculus: compare the profits to the costs and make decisions accordingly. When Bayer executives in the 1980s calculated whether to heat-treat all factor VIII or to sell unheated product overseas, they were doing the same calculation that rural methamphetamine manufacturers were doing when they decided to set up production in their homes despite the risks, comparing immediate financial benefit to longer-term consequences. The difference is that Bayer could absorb the consequences of their decision. The company had billions of dollars in assets. When hemophiliacs sued, they could afford to settle for hundreds of millions. When governments demanded accountability, they could afford to pay penalties. The financial consequences of selling contaminated blood products were substantial but not existential. The company did not go bankrupt. They did not cease to exist. They absorbed the costs and continued operating. For rural methamphetamine producers, there were no financial settlements. There was law enforcement, incarceration, health consequences. The risk profile was entirely different, but the underlying logic of the decision was the same. By the late 1990s and 2000s, methamphetamine production had been revolutionized by the entry of Mexican drug cartels into the market. The cartels recognized the enormous market opportunity that methamphetamine represented in the United States and established industrial-scale production facilities in Mexico and elsewhere. Cartel production was more efficient, more consistent, and more potent than what small-scale rural producers could achieve. The purity levels were higher, meaning that users were consuming more potent substance and were therefore at greater risk of overdose and of severe addiction. The price of methamphetamine actually decreased as cartel production expanded, making the drug more accessible to more people, and expanding the market at the precise moment when the long-term effects of methamphetamine epidemics in earlier waves of use were becoming increasingly apparent. The distribution networks that cartels established were extraordinarily sophisticated, utilizing methods developed over decades of cocaine and heroin trafficking. The violence associated with cartel operations introduced new dimensions of danger and chaos to methamphetamine markets. But from the perspective of a user seeking to purchase methamphetamine, the effect was straightforward. The drug became cheaper and more available. The cartel takeover of methamphetamine production meant that the substance that had once been primarily available through prescription or through amateur production was now available through professional criminal networks, distributed with the efficiency of any other commercial enterprise. It was during this period, as methamphetamine epidemics were reaching new peaks of intensity in rural and urban America, that Bayer was making another major acquisition that would lead to another catastrophic scandal. In 2016, Bayer announced the acquisition of Monsanto for $63 billion. Monsanto was a company with its own extraordinary history of controversial practices and questionable ethics. They had manufactured saccharin, PCBs, Agent Orange, and other chemicals associated with various harms. But what Bayer was primarily interested in was Monsanto's agricultural portfolio, particularly their ownership of glyphosate-based herbicides marketed under the brand name Roundup. Glyphosate had become the most widely used herbicide in the world. Farmers used it on crops, home gardeners used it on weeds, landscapers used it on roadsides. It was extraordinarily profitable. But there was a problem. There were already lawsuits against Monsanto claiming that Roundup caused non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, a type of blood cancer. Monsanto had been fighting these claims for years, arguing that the science did not support the cancer link, pointing to regulatory agencies around the world that had approved glyphosate as safe when used properly. The EPA said it was not carcinogenic. European regulators had approved it, but the International Agency for Research on Cancer, part of the World Health Organization, had classified glyphosate as probably carcinogenic to humans in 2015. And there were studies suggesting that long-term exposure increased cancer risk. Bayer's executives evaluated the risk. They conducted due diligence, they looked at the litigation, and they decided to proceed with the acquisition anyway. Shareholders would later claim that Bayer downplayed the litigation risk, that they misled investors about the potential liability. But in June 2018, the deal closed. Bayer paid $63 billion for Monsanto, and with it, inherited decades of accumulated lawsuits claiming that Roundup caused cancer. 2 months later, in August 2018, the first major verdict came in. Dwayne Johnson, a former school groundskeeper in California, had used Roundup regularly as part of his job. He was diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. In his trial, the jury heard evidence about Monsanto's internal documents, emails discussing research on glyphosate, memos about how to respond to cancer concerns, communications with regulators about managing public perception. The jury deliberated and returned a verdict, $289 million. Bayer's stock plummeted. The acquisition, made just 2 months earlier, suddenly looked like a catastrophic mistake. But what was actually happening was that a jury had looked at the evidence and concluded that Monsanto had acted with malice or oppression, and that enormous punitive damages were justified. The Roundup litigation that began with Dwayne Johnson's verdict in August 2018 opened floodgates that had been building for years. Johnson's case emboldened thousands of other people who had used Roundup and developed non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, farmers who had used Roundup for decades, landscapers and groundskeepers and gardeners, anyone who had used the product regularly and subsequently been diagnosed with cancer. Each verdict revealed more damaging internal Monsanto documents. Each case provided more evidence that the company had known about potential cancer risks and had worked to suppress or discredit that research. The verdicts kept coming and kept getting larger. Edwin Hardiman, a homeowner who had used Roundup on his property for more than 20 years, won his case and received $25 million. Alva and Alberta Piliad, a married couple who both developed cancer after decades of using Roundup, won a case in which the jury awarded $2 billion in punitive damages, later reduced to approximately $87 million total, but still a massive verdict that made headlines. By 2020, Bayer faced a crisis that made the HIV-contaminated blood litigation look relatively manageable. Over 125,000 filed and unfiled Roundup claims were pending. Every month, more people were diagnosed with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Every month, more lawsuits were filed. The legal costs were mounting into billions of dollars. The verdicts were unpredictable. Each new trial meant more of Monsanto's internal communications became public, more emails about influencing regulators, more evidence that the company had known about concerns and worked to suppress them. In June 2020, Bayer agreed to a settlement, $10.9 billion, to resolve approximately 100,000 claims. That was an average of about $109,000 per claimant, though actual amounts varied based on the severity of each case. But the settlement did not stop new cases from being filed. People who had used Roundup years ago and were only now being diagnosed with cancer could still sue. The settlement only covered existing claims. Future claims remained a risk. Bayer set aside an additional $1.25 billion for future claims, but it was not enough. The lawsuits continued. More verdicts, more settlements. By 2025, roughly 61,000 claims remained unresolved. Bayer kept adding money to its litigation reserves. In recent financial disclosures, they added another $1.37 billion. In March 2025, the Barnes case in Georgia resulted in a jury award of $2.1 billion, the largest Roundup verdict yet, with $2 billion in punitive damages. By November 2025, Bayer had settled the case quietly, without disclosing the settlement amount. The pattern was consistent with every major corporate scandal in Bayer's history: fight the case publicly, lose spectacularly, then settle quietly without admitting wrongdoing. Never acknowledge that the product actually caused the harm that victims claimed. Always maintain the position that you acted reasonably based on available evidence. Always emphasize regulatory compliance. Always minimize the implications of your internal documents. Bayer's stock price collapsed during this period, falling by more than 70% since the Monsanto acquisition. The $63 billion acquisition had destroyed more value than it created. By 2023, facing relentless litigation and enormous settlement costs, Bayer announced that they were reformulating Roundup for the residential U.S. market. They were removing glyphosate and replacing it with a different herbicide. But, and this was crucial, they insisted this was not because glyphosate was dangerous. It was purely to manage litigation risk. This framing was an admission that lawsuits were expensive, but not an admission that the product caused cancer. Bayer continued selling glyphosate-based Roundup for agricultural and professional use. They continued selling it worldwide. The residential reformulation was only for the U.S. market. If you were a farmer in Brazil or a landscaper in Australia, you could still buy the glyphosate version. This was precisely the same strategy they had employed with HIV-contaminated blood in the 1980s. When a product became a liability in highly regulated markets, change it or drop it in those markets, but keep selling it elsewhere. By the mid-2020s, Bayer had paid out approximately $11 billion in Roundup settlements and continued to face thousands of pending claims. The CEO Bill Anderson had been quoted saying the company was pretty much reaching the end of the road with Roundup. The company was seeking regulatory approval for a new herbicide to replace it for agricultural use. But the fundamental question remained unanswered and largely unaddressed. If Roundup is safe, why is Bayer paying billions to settle cases and reformulating the product? And if it is not safe, why did they keep selling it for years after the first cancer links emerged? The answer was always the same. It was about money, and about the calculation that short-term profitability exceeded long-term liability. By the time the lawsuits and the evidence and the human suffering became undeniable, the product had generated billions of dollars in profit. The settlements were paid from corporate reserves. The individuals who made the decisions to continue selling the product were largely retired or deceased. The corporation endured. As one examines the full arc of Bayer's history from 1863 to 2025, from the founding of a small dye company to the heroin scandal to the Nazi crimes to the HIV-contaminated blood crisis to the Roundup litigation, a pattern emerges that is simultaneously mundane and extraordinary. The pattern is mundane because it reflects how corporations are designed to function under capitalism: pursue profit, externalize costs whenever possible, resolve legal liability through settlement and denial rather than through genuine accountability. The pattern is extraordinary because of the scale of the harm, and because of how consistently Bayer has repeated it across more than 160 years despite accumulated evidence that the pattern is catastrophic. Methamphetamine followed a different institutional path than the products manufactured by Bayer. Methamphetamine was initially a pharmaceutical product synthesized by legitimate chemists and eventually manufactured as a prescription medication by Bayer itself and by other companies. Then it became a black market substance manufactured by amateur chemists, then by organized criminal enterprises. But the underlying logic remained consistent. The substance created dependency and harmed people, yet its manufacture and distribution continued because it was profitable. Whether distributed through pharmacies or through criminal networks, methamphetamine followed the same pattern: produce it, market it, or distribute it, ignore warning signs, continue as long as it is profitable, eventually scale back or discontinue, and move on to the next product. The convergence of the methamphetamine epidemic and pharmaceutical industry malfeasance in the contemporary period reveals the degree to which the same systemic forces that created heroin addiction in 1900 and HIV contamination in 1980 continue to shape pharmaceutical and drug policy in 2025. The opioid epidemic, which was driven partly by aggressive pharmaceutical marketing of prescription opioids, and partly by the shift from prescription opioids to heroin and fentanyl. As prescription access became more restricted, created conditions in which millions of Americans experienced addiction and hundreds of thousands died from overdoses. This crisis, which was substantially driven by corporate malfeasance on the part of pharmaceutical companies that aggressively marketed opioids while downplaying addiction risks, occurred simultaneously with intensifying methamphetamine epidemics in rural and urban areas. The two crises intersected in the lives of individuals using multiple substances, in treatment systems overwhelmed with polydrug addiction, and in communities devastated by cascading drug epidemics. The mechanisms through which methamphetamine produces addiction function through effects on the dopamine system, the neurological pathways that normally regulate reward, motivation, and pleasure. Methamphetamine essentially hijacks this system, producing dopamine release in quantities and with a speed that natural activities cannot match. The brain adapts to this chemical stimulation by downregulating its own dopamine production and by reducing the sensitivity of dopamine receptors, creating a state in which the person requires continued methamphetamine use to feel pleasure or to feel motivated to do anything. The neurological changes that methamphetamine produces are profound and often permanent. When a person attempts to stop using methamphetamine, the dopamine system has not yet recovered to its previous level of function, meaning that everything feels unrewarding and unmotivating. The depression that characterizes methamphetamine withdrawal is not merely sadness. It is a profound anhedonia, an inability to feel pleasure or to feel motivated that can persist for weeks or months. The convergence of methamphetamine epidemics with pharmaceutical industry litigation in the 2010s and 2020s reveals a peculiar irony. The same era in which Bayer was fighting massive litigation over Roundup and settling HIV-contaminated blood cases was an era in which methamphetamine use was reaching epidemic levels in much of the United States. The treatment systems that were supposed to help people struggling with methamphetamine addiction remained inadequate and underfunded. Medication-assisted treatment approaches that had proven effective for opioid addiction had not been adequately developed or deployed for methamphetamine use. The pharmaceutical industry had not invested in developing medications to treat methamphetamine addiction with the same intensity that they had invested in developing opioid medications or in marketing profitable products like Roundup. The answer to why treatment remained inadequate for methamphetamine when there was so much appetite for treatment of opioid addiction relates to fundamental questions about what diseases pharmaceutical companies decide to treat and what products they decide to develop. A medication that would help people struggling with methamphetamine addiction would have a smaller potential market than a product like Roundup or a widely used pain medication. The profit potential is lower. The development costs are similar. The regulatory barriers are similar, but the eventual revenue would be less. Pharmaceutical companies make decisions about what to develop based partly on clinical need, but significantly on anticipated profitability. A drug that treats a relatively rare disease can command extraordinarily high prices because patients have no alternatives and insurance companies will pay to prevent catastrophic illness. A drug that treats a common condition like methamphetamine addiction, but that is used by a relatively poor and marginalized population, cannot command high prices. The market logic of pharmaceutical development in capitalist economies means that some needs are addressed and some are not based on which would do the most good but based on which are most profitable. The fundamental question that emerges from examining both Bayer's history and the trajectory of methamphetamine in America is, how is it that institutions continue to function and continue to be respected despite causing massive harm? How does a company survive committing crimes against humanity, paying settlements for knowingly distributing disease-contaminated products, and fighting for years about whether it actually caused cancer? How does an industry continue to operate with minimal accountability when the substances it produces are addicting millions of people? The answer lies partly in legal and corporate structures, partly in the way collective memory is shaped by institutions, partly in our own complicity as consumers and participants in systems that profit from harm. The legal protection afforded by corporate structure is extraordinary. When IG Farben was dissolved after World War II, the successor companies were not legally responsible for IG Farben's crimes. When Bayer acquired Monsanto, they acquired an enormous liability, but they also negotiated limits on that liability. When individual executives committed crimes, they could be tried, but they were almost never convicted, and when they were convicted, sentences were light. Fritz Termeer served 7 years for slavery and mass murder. No Bayer executive went to prison for the HIV-contaminated blood scandal. No criminal charges have been filed related to Roundup, only civil lawsuits. The criminal justice system and the civil litigation system have different burdens of proof and different incentives. The civil system can impose enormous financial penalties. $10 billion settlements sound substantial, but they do not impose imprisonment. They do not remove individuals from power. They do not prevent the corporation from continuing to operate and to profit. The institutional ability to escape accountability by reshaping the historical record is extraordinary. The heroin scandal that killed thousands was largely erased from Bayer's official history. The Nazi crimes were acknowledged only decades later, after most survivors had died. The HIV-contaminated blood scandal was settled quietly with minimal publicity. The Roundup litigation is ongoing, but the company maintains that glyphosate is not carcinogenic despite billions in settlements. Each scandal creates an opportunity to reframe the narrative, to minimize what happened, to move on. And the passage of time serves corporate interests. As decades pass, the witnesses die, the evidence becomes harder to verify, public attention moves to new scandals, and what seemed like an enormous injustice gradually recedes into history. The contemporary moment in 2025 presents a peculiar state of affairs in which multiple drug crises are occurring simultaneously, in which corporate accountability remains inadequate, and in which the systemic problems that created these crises remain largely unaddressed. The methamphetamine epidemic continues to devastate communities. The opioid epidemic, though receiving more policy attention and more treatment resources than methamphetamine, continues to kill tens of thousands annually. Pharmaceutical companies continue to make decisions about drug development and pricing based on profit calculations rather than on need. Bayer continues to manufacture products, including the original aspirin that millions of people depend on while continuing to fight lawsuits over Roundup, and while having settled enormous cases regarding HIV-contaminated blood. The company employs over 100,000 people. It generates over $50 billion in annual revenue. It is worth billions of dollars. It has survived every scandal, every lawsuit, every investigation. This survival reflects several interconnected truths about how modern capitalism and corporate structures function. First, corporations are designed to be immortal in ways that human beings are not. A human who commits murder faces personal consequences: prison, loss of freedom, social stigma. A corporation that causes death through the decisions of its executives faces only financial consequences, and those consequences are paid from corporate reserves, not from the personal wealth or freedom of the decision makers. The executives retire with their pensions intact. The corporation adjusts and continues. Second, corporations have resources to fight legal accountability through means that individuals cannot. They employ armies of lawyers who can delay proceedings, file endless appeals, negotiate settlements that include confidentiality clauses preventing public disclosure. They have lobbying operations that can influence legislation to limit their liability. They can literally write laws by funding politicians who will propose regulations favorable to industry. Third, corporations benefit from the passage of time in ways that justice does not. Witnesses die or become unreliable. Evidence degrades or is lost. Public attention moves to new scandals. The individual human suffering caused by corporate decisions recedes from public consciousness. But the corporation continues. It was founded in 1863. It will likely continue for centuries more. No individual associated with it will live long enough to face the full consequences of corporate decision-making. Fourth, corporations control the narrative of their own history. They decide which documents to preserve and which to destroy. They hire public relations firms to manage their image. They sponsor research that appears to vindicate their positions. They lobby media outlets and academic institutions. They shape how their history is understood and remembered. The COVID-19 pandemic provided an additional test case for how pharmaceutical companies made decisions about what to produce, how to price it, and who to sell it to. The pandemic created an enormous demand for vaccines and treatments. Pharmaceutical companies benefited enormously from this demand. They charged high prices for vaccines. They restricted supply to maintain prices. They insisted on intellectual property protections that prevented generic production in developing countries. The vaccine development itself was remarkable. The speed with which effective vaccines were created represented genuine pharmaceutical achievement. But the implementation and distribution reflected the same logic that has characterized pharmaceutical decision-making throughout Bayer's history. maximize profit, minimize distribution to poor countries, insist on intellectual property protection, and maintain high prices. The result was that wealthy countries had abundant vaccine supply while developing countries had scarce supply, leading to millions of deaths that might have been prevented with more equitable distribution and lower prices. This pattern, genuine pharmaceutical innovation existing alongside decisions that maximize corporate profit at the cost of human life, characterizes the contemporary pharmaceutical industry. Medications that could save lives are priced so high that patients cannot afford them. Medications that are off-patent but that are still essential are sometimes priced at 10,000% markups simply because the company acquired the right to produce them. Research into diseases that affect wealthy populations in wealthy countries receives enormous funding, while research into diseases that primarily affect poor populations in developing countries receives minimal funding. The system works as designed. It produces pharmaceutical innovation, but allocates that innovation based on profit potential rather than based on health need. The methamphetamine crisis in this context remains largely a crisis of populations with limited economic power. Rural populations, working-class populations, marginalized populations. These populations cannot command the prices that wealthy populations can. They cannot fund research into treatments. They do not vote in ways that make methamphetamine treatment a political priority compared to other crises. The result is that methamphetamine treatment remains inadequate, that prevention efforts remain underfunded, that the crisis continues to consume lives without adequate response. A pharmaceutical company could develop effective medications for methamphetamine addiction if the profit potential were high enough. But the profit potential is not high enough, so the medications are not developed and the crisis continues. The question that emerges from this analysis is whether the contemporary system for allocating pharmaceutical resources and holding pharmaceutical companies accountable is actually broken, or whether it is functioning exactly as designed. The answer appears to be the latter. The system is designed to maximize corporate profit and shareholder value. It does that extremely effectively. The system is not designed to minimize harm, to prevent addiction, to ensure that everyone has access to needed medications, or to hold corporations accountable for decisions that kill people. It is designed to allow corporations to calculate the costs of harm against the profits from harmful products and to make decisions based on that calculation. And it is functioning exactly as designed. The tragedy is not that the system is broken. The tragedy is that the system is working perfectly to accomplish its actual purpose, which is profit maximization rather than its stated purpose, which is health protection. In 2025, 162 years after Bayer was founded, the fundamental patterns that characterize the company's decision-making throughout its history remain in place. Develop or acquire profitable products, market them aggressively, ignore warning signs of harm, continue selling as long as profitable. When litigation or regulation becomes too costly, reformulate, settle, or exit the market. Never admit fault, move on to the next product. The aspirin in your medicine cabinet is Bayer's. The Claritin you take for allergies is Bayer's. The Midol women take for menstrual pain is Bayer's. These are genuine medications that help people feel better. The company that makes them also made heroin for children, also partnered with Nazis to conduct lethal experiments on prisoners, also sold HIV-contaminated blood to developing countries, also fought billions in settlements over Roundup. All of these things are true simultaneously. The company that produces genuine medical benefits also produces catastrophic harms. The company that employs innovative scientists also employs executives who make calculations about acceptable harm. The company that contributes to medical research also lobbies against regulations that would limit their profits. The final and perhaps most unsettling aspect of this analysis concerns what it reveals about how modern societies make decisions about the distribution of drugs, pharmaceutical products, and chemical substances that affect human health and addiction. Both the methamphetamine crisis and Bayer's various scandals reveal that decision-making about these substances is fundamentally driven by calculations about profit and cost, not by calculations about human welfare. The production of methamphetamine in rural America responded to economic incentives. People manufactured the drug because it was more profitable than alternatives in regions where alternative opportunities had disappeared. The prescription of methamphetamine and amphetamines in 1950s and 1960s America responded to corporate marketing and to genuine, if misdirected, efforts by physicians to help patients manage fatigue and low mood. The distribution of HIV-contaminated blood by Bayer responded to the calculation that destroying contaminated inventory would be more expensive than selling it overseas. The continued sale of Roundup despite cancer lawsuits responds to calculations that settlements are more cost-effective than product withdrawal. The mechanism through which society could theoretically prevent these harms, regulatory oversight, has been systematically weakened by pharmaceutical and chemical companies through lobbying, through funding of sympathetic politicians, through the employment of former regulators in corporate positions, and through the subtle corruption of regulatory agencies through revolving door employment patterns. A young regulator at the FDA who reviews pharmaceutical applications and makes recommendations about safety might reasonably anticipate that after a few years of government service, they could move into a high-paying position with a pharmaceutical company that would benefit from their knowledge of regulatory processes and regulatory decision-makers. This creates incentives for subtle bias toward pharmaceutical companies in regulatory decision-making. The same pattern repeats at environmental agencies, at health departments, at every level of government where corporate interests intersect with regulatory authority. The treatment of addiction as a criminal matter rather than as a public health matter compounds the problem. When methamphetamine use is treated primarily through criminal justice, through arrest and incarceration, rather than through treatment and public health approaches, the costs are enormous and the effectiveness is minimal. A person arrested for methamphetamine use is removed from their community, is incarcerated at enormous cost, is exposed to criminal networks and criminal culture in prisons, and upon release faces barriers to employment and housing that make reintegration into society extraordinarily difficult. The recidivism rates are high because incarceration without treatment does not address the underlying addiction. Meanwhile, treatment capacity remains inadequate because funding for treatment is much lower than funding for incarceration. This allocation of resources reflects not rational decision-making, but rather political considerations and historical accident. The war on drugs, declared in the 1970s and 1980s, created enormous law enforcement and incarceration infrastructure. Prisons were built. Prison guard unions became powerful political constituencies. Law enforcement agencies received federal funding. The infrastructure became politically difficult to change, because changing it would mean reducing law enforcement budgets and eliminating prison jobs. Meanwhile, treatment infrastructure never received comparable funding. Treatment programs are often underfunded, understaffed, difficult to access, and frequently ineffective because they are designed around models that address individual behavior rather than addressing the social and economic conditions that make addiction appealing. The evidence from countries that have taken different approaches, that have treated addiction as a public health matter rather than as a criminal matter, that have provided accessible treatment and maintained it even when patients relapsed, that have addressed the social and economic conditions that make drug use appealing, suggests that dramatically different outcomes are possible. Portugal decriminalized all drugs in 2001 and shifted resources from law enforcement to treatment and social support. The result was that drug use initially increased slightly but then declined, that HIV transmission decreased, that overdose deaths decreased, that treatment seeking increased. The data is clear. Public health approaches to addiction work better than criminal justice approaches. But the United States and most other countries continue to allocate far more resources to criminalization than to treatment and public health. The question that this raises is whether the failure to implement evidence-based approaches reflects rational decision-making about priorities or reflects the power of constituencies that benefit from the current system. The answer appears to be the latter. Law enforcement agencies benefit from drug enforcement budgets. Private prisons benefit from incarceration. Pharmaceutical companies benefit from high drug prices, and from the fact that treatment for addiction is inadequately funded and therefore less likely to succeed, ensuring continued demand for the substances that people are addicted to. The political constituencies that benefit from the current system have power to influence policy, while the constituencies that are harmed by the current system, people struggling with addiction, their families, their communities, have less political power. This brings the analysis back to the fundamental question about corporate accountability, and about how societies allow institutions to cause massive harm without experiencing consequences that would seem adequate in a rational system. The answer involves understanding that the system itself, the economic system, the legal system, the regulatory system, is designed to benefit those with power and wealth. Corporations have power and wealth. Individuals struggling with addiction do not. Regulatory agencies are supposed to protect the public, but are staffed by people who anticipate moving into corporate positions and by people who are subject to political pressure from politicians funded by pharmaceutical companies. The criminal justice system punishes individual drug users but protects the corporate decision-makers who created the conditions for addiction. The civil litigation system can impose enormous fines but cannot remove people from power or prevent them from making similar decisions in the future. The trajectory from Nagai's synthesis of methamphetamine in Japan in 1893 to Bayer's contemporary Roundup litigation in 2025 spans 132 years and reveals the persistent operation of the same underlying logic: the calculation that short-term profit exceeds long-term cost, the decision to continue producing and distributing substances despite evidence of serious harm, the minimization of historical records when scandals become undeniable. The use of corporate structure and legal complexity to shield individuals from accountability, and the ability of institutions to survive and thrive despite causing death and destruction on enormous scales. The historical record demonstrates conclusively that pharmaceutical and chemical companies have had multiple opportunities to choose different paths, to prioritize human welfare over profit, to discontinue harmful products, or to implement safety measures even when those measures were costly. And at each of these opportunities, they have consistently chosen profit. This consistency across more than a century suggests that the problem is not a matter of occasional moral failure by particular individuals or particular companies. The problem is structural. It is rooted in the fundamental logic of capitalism, in the imperative to maximize profit, to externalize costs whenever possible, to expand markets and increase consumption. Within this logic, harm is acceptable as long as the costs of the harm are less than the profits generated by the harmful product. This calculation does not change based on whether the product is heroin or methamphetamine or glyphosate or blood products. The calculation is the same. And the result is the same: continued production and distribution of harmful substances when they are profitable, reformulation or discontinuation when they are no longer profitable, or when legal liability becomes too expensive. The fact that Bayer has survived all of these scandals, has not been liquidated, has not had its assets seized, has not been forbidden from operating, reveals something fundamental about the power imbalance in modern societies. Corporations have enormous power. They have resources to fight legal battles for decades. They have ability to shape legislation. They have ability to control their own narratives. Individuals have far less power. A person harmed by a pharmaceutical product can sue, but the lawsuit will likely take years to resolve, will require enormous legal expenses, and will likely result in a settlement that amounts to a fraction of what a full reckoning would require. The victims die during the litigation process. The perpetrators retire. The corporation adjusts and continues. The COVID-19 pandemic provided another test case for whether institutions might change their fundamental logic in the face of catastrophic circumstances. The answer was no. Pharmaceutical companies developed vaccines at remarkable speed. This represented genuine scientific achievement, but they priced them extraordinarily high. They used intellectual property law to prevent poor countries from manufacturing generic versions. They resisted mandatory licensing. They ensured that wealthy countries had abundant vaccines, while developing countries had scarce supply. The profit motive operated even in the context of a global pandemic. This suggests that change in corporate behavior will not come from moral reasoning or from appeals to consider human welfare. Change will come only when the costs of harmful behavior exceed the profits, or when regulatory or legal constraints make harmful behavior impossible. This raises the question of what would need to change to actually hold pharmaceutical and chemical companies accountable in meaningful ways. The civil litigation system has been useful. The billions in settlements have at least imposed some cost on corporate malfeasance. But the settlements have not prevented corporations from continuing to profit from harmful products, have not removed executives from power, have not changed the fundamental logic of decision-making. Criminal prosecution would be more meaningful if executives faced personal consequences like imprisonment rather than corporate consequences that are paid from corporate reserves. But criminal prosecution requires regulatory agencies to have both the will and the resources to pursue it. And regulatory agencies are often compromised by the revolving door employment patterns and by political pressure. Regulatory prohibition would be more meaningful if regulatory agencies could ban pharmaceutical products that cause serious harm, but regulatory agencies are reluctant to use their prohibition authority even when harm is documented, partly because of industry pressure, partly because prohibition is politically difficult, partly because of the complexity of determining causation and attribution. Forced divestiture or liquidation of corporations would be theoretically possible, but is almost never used, even in the most egregious cases, because the political will to dissolve a major corporation does not exist given the economic disruption it would cause. The system is designed to be incremental, to allow corporations to adjust at the margins rather than to force fundamental change or to remove them from power. It is in this context that the contemporary drug crises, methamphetamine, opioids, and others, should be understood. These crises are not natural disasters. They are not inevitable consequences of human nature or of the existence of dangerous substances. They are consequences of specific decisions made by specific institutions about how to produce, distribute, and profit from addictive substances. They are consequences of regulatory failure, of political corruption, of the subordination of health concerns to profit concerns, and they will not be resolved without addressing the fundamental incentives that drive these institutions. As long as pharmaceutical companies have incentives to produce and market addictive and harmful substances, they will do so. As long as criminal justice systems are funded at higher levels than treatment systems, people will be incarcerated rather than treated. As long as corporations can escape accountability by paying settlements that are smaller than the profits generated by harmful products, they will continue producing those products. The conclusion that emerges from this examination of Bayer's history and the trajectory of methamphetamine in American society is not optimistic, but it is at least clear. The problem is not that individual executives are uniquely evil or that particular companies are uniquely corrupt. The problem is structural. It is rooted in how capitalism allocates resources, in how corporate structures shield individuals from accountability, in how legal systems are designed to protect property rights and profit motives more vigorously than they protect human welfare. Until these fundamental structures change, the pattern will repeat. New products will be developed. They will be marketed aggressively. Warning signs will be ignored or minimized. They will cause harm. Eventually, lawsuits will force settlements or product reformulation. The cycle will continue with the next product. This is not to say that no change is possible or that all corporations behave identically. Some pharmaceutical companies have made different decisions about pricing, about transparency, about acknowledging potential harms. Some regulatory agencies have acted more forcefully than others. Some countries have implemented different approaches to drug policy that have produced better outcomes. But these exceptions prove the rule: change happens slowly, incrementally, and only when powerful constituencies push for it or when the costs of harm become undeniable. The default trajectory, absent external pressure, is toward continued production of profitable but harmful products. For individuals struggling with methamphetamine addiction in 2025, the implications are clear and disheartening. The treatment systems that might help them are underfunded and often unavailable. The medications that might assist their recovery have not been adequately developed because the profit potential does not justify the investment. The social and economic conditions that make methamphetamine use appealing, poverty, lack of opportunity, lack of community, remain unaddressed. The criminal justice system is more likely to incarcerate them than to treat them. The likelihood of successful recovery without enormous personal effort and luck remains low. Meanwhile, the substances causing their addiction continue to be produced and distributed through pharmaceutical channels where still legal, through criminal networks where prohibited. The machine continues functioning as designed. For the victims of Bayer's scandals, the hemophiliacs who contracted HIV from contaminated blood, the groundskeepers and farmers who developed cancer from Roundup, the children who were addicted to heroin in 1900, the prisoners who were worked to death at Auschwitz, the implications are that full accountability was never achieved and likely never will be. Some received financial settlements that compensated them inadequately for their losses. Some received official acknowledgments that something regrettable had happened decades ago. Some received nothing. The individuals responsible for the most catastrophic decisions have mostly died without facing consequences that would seem adequate. The corporation that implemented these decisions survives and thrives. The aspirin that Bayer produces is a beneficial medication. Millions of people use it safely and effectively. The innovation that produced aspirin was genuine scientific achievement. But the same company that produced aspirin also produced heroin, also partnered with the Nazis, also distributed contaminated blood, also fought billions in settlements over Roundup. This is the fundamental paradox of how pharmaceutical and chemical companies function in capitalist societies. They produce genuine goods alongside catastrophic harms. The benefits and the harms come from the same source, are driven by the same incentives, are difficult to separate. The challenge for individuals and societies is navigating this reality. We cannot entirely avoid purchasing products from companies with questionable histories, because every major corporation has such histories if examined closely enough. We cannot eliminate pharmaceutical companies because they do produce beneficial medicines. We cannot simply rely on regulatory oversight because regulatory systems are compromised by the interests they are supposed to regulate. What remains is the difficult work of supporting strong enforcement of existing laws, of pushing for new regulations where needed, of choosing which companies to support based on their track records, of demanding transparency about potential harms, of insisting on public funding for research into treatments for addiction and disease rather than relying solely on pharmaceutical companies to determine what gets researched. Most fundamentally, what remains is the need to acknowledge that the system is functioning as designed, and that if we want different outcomes, we need to change the system. This is not a call for simple solutions, there are none. Public investment in drug treatment infrastructure, in prevention, in addressing the social and economic conditions that make addiction appealing, remains inadequately funded. Regulatory agencies need more resources and more independence from industry pressure to properly oversee pharmaceutical and chemical companies. Criminal penalties for corporate decision-makers need to be stronger and more consistently applied. Intellectual property protections need to be weakened to allow poor countries to manufacture generic versions of essential medications. The profit motives that drive the allocation of pharmaceutical research and the pricing of medications need to be constrained through regulation and through public investment in drug development. These are not radical or unprecedented suggestions. Countries with better outcomes on addiction, on pharmaceutical pricing, on access to medications, have implemented many of these changes. But implementing them in the United States and other countries requires overcoming entrenched political interests and requires a level of political will that has not existed. This creates a situation in which the known problems persist despite the existence of known solutions. People continue to be harmed. Corporations continue to profit, the machine continues functioning. In 2025, 162 years after Bayer was founded, the company remains one of the world's largest pharmaceutical and chemical companies. It manufactures products that millions of people depend on. It employs over 100,000 people. It generates over $50 billion in annual revenue. It faces thousands of Roundup lawsuits and has paid out billions in settlements. It continues selling glyphosate-based products in many parts of the world. The executives who made decisions about Roundup continue their careers largely unscathed. The victims of those decisions continue to suffer from cancer and to die. The corporation calculates and adjusts and continues. Methamphetamine epidemics continue to devastate communities. The treatment systems that might help remain inadequate. The social and economic conditions that make the drug appealing remain unchanged. The substance continues to be produced and distributed. Users continue to become addicted. The machine continues functioning. This is the story of how pharmaceutical innovation and catastrophic harm emerge from the same institutions, driven by the same logic, protected by the same legal structures. It is a story that extends from the laboratories of 19th century Germany to contemporary courtrooms, from heroin for children to Roundup for crops, from Nazi medical experiments to HIV-contaminated blood to billions of dollars in settlements that do not prevent future harms. It is a story about power, about accountability, and about the difficulty of constraining human institutions once they have grown large enough to shape the societies within which they operate. And it is a story that continues to unfold, with each new scandal and each new product following patterns established more than a century ago. Until the underlying structures that enable this pattern change, the story will continue to repeat, with new products and new victims, but with the same fundamental logic driving the decisions that cause harm. The tragedy is not that corporations are evil. The tragedy is that the system that governs them is designed in ways that make catastrophic harm acceptable as long as it remains profitable. Changing that system would require political will that does not currently exist and would require overcoming entrenched interests that benefit from the current arrangement. In the absence of such change, We can expect the patterns documented in this history to continue: genuine innovation alongside catastrophic harm, settlements alongside the absence of meaningful accountability, the corporation surviving and thriving while the individuals harmed by its decisions suffer or die. This is not inevitable, but it is what the current system produces, and it is what will continue to be produced without fundamental change.